got coffee culture. Sorry, a little technical difficulty here. So I don't know if Burc has gone over any of this yet, but basically a little bit of a map of where really coffee starts. A lot of people are familiar with Ethiopia. Basically, it's where the beans, the plant begins. It basically starts as you would expect. Small farms, they're growing a lot of subsistence crops. We're also growing coffee for just home consumption. At this time, I don't know if it's mentioned before, it's really being drunk more like with the cherry. So the bean isn't taken out yet quite. It's brewed with the cherry, so you kind of almost think of it almost like a cherry soup that you're drinking. But that's how it's done. Eventually, what we're going to do is we're going to skip across the Red Sea to Yemen. And this map doesn't really show it, but there's a string of mountains right here. These are actually called the Harar Mountains, which you might be familiar with because there's a thing called Harar coffee. And there is a seasonal monsoon that hits these mountains that allows them to grow coffee basically through, I think it's about a 6-month period. They're really smart in the way they do it, and I'll have a slide of that, but they essentially think of the coffee, like you just saw coffee in a very tropical area. These people are catching it in almost like big stone catchers, and they're planting it. They look like rose bushes instead of a large green coffee farm. But this is really the first place coffee is grown and then exported. I included this. So this is a Ethiopian sort of a coffee, you might call it a ceremony. The reason sort of the flowers are laid out is she is probably the sort of the matron of the house, and she's probably receiving guests or family. This is done, it's pretty common in Ethiopia in the early days anyways. And they're going to brew the coffee right in front of everybody, right out in the open. This is kind of honoring the guests too, right? Look at all the work I'm doing for you. So this is really the beginning of the Ethiopian highlands. Next, we'll move on to the port of Mocha. So you've all heard of probably Mocha coffee, but not the chocolate type. This is where it comes from, Mocha. Mocha is actually, let me go back here, this little spire here. So this becomes the main hub of export for all that Harar coffee that's grown in these mountains in Harar. And really, this is where I guess you could say coffee culture starts, because it's now moved from the sort of agricultural rural areas to now towns and cities. And that is now being exported through different parts of, initially through trade. Yemen goes through a lot of different sort of civil wars and tribal wars until it's essentially conquered by the Ottomans, who kind of unify it in a sense. And the Ottomans essentially get most of their coffee initially from this area in Yemen. It's basically remained the major port of transport to the Arab and Ottoman world through the 15th century. And then, like I said, under Selim I, the conquest is completed in the 16th century. So moving on to Ottoman world in Istanbul, this is a sort of the scene of sort of a coffee house. This is really where you get the first coffee houses in the Arab and Ottoman world. But what I'd like to talk is about culture. So you can see a lot of different things going on here. You got these guys playing probably something like backgammon. Got the vendor. We've got some sort of bigwigs up here. Maybe neighborhood heads, guys who know people who know people. We've got musicians. Everybody's drinking coffee. One of these is probably a storyteller. It's very common in these coffee shops. But they become these neighborhood gathering places. They're also considering coffee at this time medicinal. It cures a lot of ills. And also, if you're familiar in the Ottoman and Arab world, where Islam is prevalent, alcohol is really forbidden. So coffee is a good alternative. Their tea is also available, but coffee really takes over. The kind of thing I found out was they actually attempted to grow coffee. I didn't know this, but in the islands of the Mediterranean at one point, but it really didn't work out because the area in Yemen and Harar just couldn't keep up with the demand. And so they kept trying to find better ways to sort of mass produce, but really it pretty much stayed in that part of the world for quite a while. This is just another view of the coffee house. So I like to point out is, I kind of figured out was water, right? What was that? Water. So if you want good coffee, you're going to have water. And if you want water, you're going to have to get piped into the system. So this is a coffee house in Istanbul. And if you want to get piped in the system, you've got to know the guys who know the people who know the people. Probably sitting back here being served very nicely. But it was also a good place that you were going to find people traveling. So this became sort of the all-around news center as well. If you were traveling, you're going through a major city, you're probably going to look for the coffee house, not just to drink coffee, but to find out what's going on, essentially. This guy, anybody familiar? So this is a janissary. You familiar with this? Janissary is essentially a professional soldier in the Ottoman army. They're usually taken as children and put into an academy. They usually go into sort of the war side or the engineering side. But they basically have to be soldiers for a good part of their life. What ends up happening is they have to retire at one point because, being a soldier is kind of dangerous. And that's what they end up doing is a lot of Ottoman coffee houses in Istanbul particularly are usually former janissaries. They're essentially looking at it as a retirement program. So I just thought it was kind of a neat little thing I could plug in there. The other thing about the coffee shops at this time, I'll go back to the other one, is they sort of double. They're coffee shops. A lot of times they're wine shops. They're not supposed to be selling wine, but they're selling wine out back. They're also barber shops. And then various stages, particularly in Istanbul and the Ottoman world, is because these are gathering places, these are also places where you can have a lot of political dissent, right? People are gathering, saying, oh, so-and-so's not doing such a great job. A lot of these guys are former janissaries. They have connections to the army. So a lot of times the administrations and the government would see them as pretty nasty places to have open because they could foment revolt from these little places like this. So they would shut it down and say, well, you can't sell coffee anymore. So they turn into a barber shop, and they're doing coffee and wine out the back, right? And then they sort of change hands, but it's always sort of the same thing. They always find some way to keep it going and sort of sell coffee somewhere. Next one. This is sort of where the Ottoman world meets the rest of Europe. This is an embassy of Mehmet IV, the French court of Louis XIV, here in 1669. Essentially, just a political note is, typically the Ottomans are often at war with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They're the ones bumping up next to them in the Balkans. And the French are typically the rival to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So they're kind of hemmed in by Austria on one side, and then their cousins, the Bourbons in Spain, on the other side. So it was really good politics to make friends, right? The Ottomans could be your ally if the Austrians are knocking at your door. So one of the things that happened at this particular meeting was coffee was served basically by this fellow here. His name is Suleiman Aga. Basically, he's the ambassador, and he's serving it sort of at his diplomatic estate. He's living in Paris as a diplomat. And he's inviting different sort of important people in government to come over and try this coffee. Now, coffee had already sort of kind of got its way into Europe in a lot of small ways. It had got into places like Venice very early on because they have trade with the East, in other parts of Eastern Europe, but it wasn't really introduced to sort of what you might call the big powers quite yet. So that's why I thought it was interesting to show this sort of first meeting. So basically, this also starts something what you might call, it's a term you might know called Orientalism. Are you familiar with this? So Orientalism is essentially a bit of a European fascination with the East. right? Once they start making contact, they become quite fascinated with it. And coffee was often quite the door to that. Go ahead and hit this one. This is actually the first time that coffee is served in Paris. There's the Fair Saint-Germain, which is a sort of a church in Saint-Germain in Paris. And one of the fellows who worked for that Sui Managa was, his name was Pascal, and he's said to be an Armenian in service of Sui Managa. And he basically takes advantage of this essentially church fair to sell coffee outside. And it becomes a bit of a sensation because most people have never had this before. It's something quite new. He later opens a permanent shop, and then it kind of like dies away. And this is kind of where I get into what I'm going to go into now, which is you could go to every European country in all parts of the world and give you a little history of it. But I'm going to take two cities, essentially. I'm going to take London and Paris. And I'm going to show the differences between their coffee cultures. And then a little bit later, we'll go into how it goes into the New World. So if you want to go ahead and skip over to the next. So this is a Parisian coffee house, very early on. So we're talking late 17th century, early 18th century. But one thing I want you to notice here is, it's hard to tell, it's not the best thing you can get, but it's a mixed company. There's men and women drinking coffee together. They usually use sort of a Turkish or Eastern theme. It's a bit more opulent. So it's almost sort of like this sort of Disneyland of an experience, right? You're being transported to, the Seraglio, which is what they would call the palace in Istanbul. You're having coffee there. There were some others that started selling coffee, mostly Armenians and Syrians, Greek Syrians too. A fellow named Stephen of Aleppo, other Levantines. These are people from the Near East, and then a fellow named Joseph. They open coffees with this kind of like decor, plush pillows. But the main thing to notice is that it is mixed company, and it's a little bit more opulent than you're going to see later. So if you want to hit the next. This right here is Madame de Pompadour. She is essentially the official mistress of Louis XV. And this is sort of her fascination with Easternism and coffee. She's got herself set up as some sort of sultana, some sort of queen of the Ottoman Empire, and she wants to be painted drinking coffee. This is, again, part of the fascination with the East. Let's see where I'm at here. Go ahead and next, please. And this is sort of a French, this is actually in France, and it's essentially a ladies, I call it a ladies' coffee party. But they sort of decorated the house with cushions like you might find in Istanbul. So again, this is more part of the fascination with Orientalism. They're also sort of dressing up with the way they think people in the East dress like, right? It's not always accurate, but again, it's sort of a little bit of a fantasy. And then here we go with just sort of a kind of a well-to-do couple in the 18th century. This is a painting by a fellow named Jean-Baptiste Rameau, painted about 1730. Actually, sorry, this is a painting by Bezier. But what I want to show you here is this couple. This obviously took a lot of money sorry, they had to pay quite a bit of money for this painting. And they thought this was going to last in posterity probably for their family, right? This is the couple that's going to become, this is mom and dad, this is grandma and grandpa that the grandkids are going to see much later after they're dead and gone. One of the things they choose to show is they're drinking coffee. So again, it's a sign of sort of up and coming. Want to go next, please? This is inside a Café Burc. This fellow here is supposed to be Voltaire. Is anyone familiar with him? Voltaire, he wrote Candide. He's essentially part of what they might call the Enlightenment movement. I won't go too much into Voltaire, but essentially what I want to show is this is another side to the French coffee scene. The first true permanent coffee houses end up starting in Paris near the Comédie Française, which is basically the theater house. This Café Burc was opened by a fellow. Now, this is the kind of thing is you get different names, but as far as I can tell, his name is François Procopio de Cotelli. Basically, he was either a Florentine or Sicilian. They're originally licensed to sell lemonade, but added coffee and chocolate. When coffee entered into Italy, a lot of the coffee houses were actually what we would consider lemonade houses or lemonade stands, and coffee was sort of a side drink. But as coffee started to grow in popularity, those Italian sort of coffee houses became true coffee houses, and they stopped selling the lemonade. So a lot of times what you see Italians like this fellow, going to Paris, starting a lemonade house, and then realizing coffee was a better seller, and continuing on. But you can see, again, what's happening here. It attracts philosophers, intellectuals, guys like Benjamin Franklin, basically when he was visiting Paris would go to a place like this. A lot of actors and creatives, and again, just like you saw in the Ottoman world, it's a gathering place, right? This is something that people are doing in public. People are not doing this so much at home unless you have the means like the previous couple, right? Because what do you got to do? You got to buy green coffee, you got to have somebody roast it, you got to have somebody brew it. If you're some rich guy, you're not going to do that yourself. You're going to have to pay somebody to do that, right? And if you're a regular person, like a lot of these people, you're going to have to go to a coffee house. But you're also going to want to go there, again, to discuss, to find out, news. And it's mixed company again. This is sort of the French version of it. So if you want to see. This is Café Burc today. This is the same place. It's still open. This place opened in either 1686 or 1689. We're not quite sure. We get one of those 2 years. Go ahead, next please. This is the interior.
Yes, before we go.
Yeah.
If anybody wants more coffee, I have here the unsweetened ones, some sweetened ones, and I have water in between. So if you want water or coffee, find out yourself.
Thank you.
You want some? It's all here.
So you kind of notice still opulent, compared to sort of there's no sawdust on the floor in this place. And of course, a lot of cafes turn into also places to eat, which you still have in Paris. Usually a cafe doesn't just mean you're getting coffee, you're actually getting something to eat as well. But a little bit more elegant. So now if we go to the next one, now we're going to move to sort of the London coffee house. Does anybody notice the difference, besides the guys who are really big? It's all guys, it's all men, right? It's pretty basic. There's just wood on the floor. There's 1 or 2 paintings. There's nothing else going on, but just there's guys debating again. It's still a gathering place, but it's not sort of it's not a place of what you might call it. Doesn't have that Disneyland feel. It's just about the coffee and the arguments essentially by this point. There's a lot of academic talk going on. It starts out in the becoming very popular in the academic world. It's considered an intellectually stimulating drink, and it's also an alternative to alcohol. Because before coffee and tea entered the world here, you've got a lot of people going to ale houses and pretty much getting drunk. So because you couldn't really drink the water, right? A lot of these places, you drink the water, you're going to get dysentery and maybe die. So a brewed drink would be a little bit better. And a lot of things would go down here. This is a fight over some philosophical Cartesian dream idea. This is where the term, actually Penny University comes in. Something Burc is familiar with is you could pay for a cup of coffee with a penny and pretty much get a good education and then, get a show too. So a lot of things are going on there.
What is the kid there?
What's that?
Who's the kids there?
I don't know, some poor kid serving coffee. Yeah, if you want to go ahead and to the next one. I thought this was kind of neat. This is another coffee house called Willis, Best Coffee House. They're also serving other things like tobacco. So pretty early on, some people say, cigars and coffee. This is pipes and coffee. They're kind of going hand in hand as pairing them together. Go ahead and move on. This is just a little sign that shows the London's first coffee house. in 1652. Now this is the kind of interesting thing is, we had a guy named Pascal start the coffee house in Paris, but this is earlier. But this guy's name is Pasqua. So there's a lot of ideas that it's actually the same guy. Maybe he went to Paris first, or he went to London first. He sort of died out and he came back. But as far as we can tell, here, this coffee house opens in 1652. And let's get to the next one. This guy's name was Pascal. Go back. Pascal Rosé. He was actually, again, it's kind of hard to tell who's who, but it said he's either a Greek from Ragusa or he's actually from the Ottoman world, but he's definitely a Greek. In 1652, he returns from what in Turks would call Izmir, or it's also called Smyrna, as a servant of an English merchant named Daniel Edwards, who's basically trading in wares from the East. And he begins a coffee shop near the Royal Exchange in the financial district. So a lot of people running around essentially in commerce, and they have coffee basically to keep them going, they think. It's called the Jamaica Wine House. It's also called the Turk's Head. So they like those kind of names back then. So you want to go to the next one? Oh, this is the wrong one, but I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead anyways. Just before I hit there, that oldest coffee shop in London is still there as well, but it doesn't serve coffee anymore. It just serves booze.
Reverted back.
Yeah, it basically reverted back. There's sort of a thing that happens in the British Isles where coffee loses popularity to tea, and it's because of these guys. This is a little bit of a segue, but is anyone familiar with this sign here? This is the East India Company. East India Company, if you're familiar, is just a massive company that had a lot of investment from those in government in Britain. And so they had quite an effect on coffee drinking in the United Kingdom, mostly because they cornered the market on tea. And they pushed that tea on the public, and coffee sort of went downhill in consumption. Some people say, well, tea's a lot easier to make. You just put the leaves in and pour the hot water, whereas coffee, you got to buy it, you got to roast it at home and whatnot. So, but it loses quite a bit of popularity. If you want to go to the next. This is basically known as the Boston Tea Party. This is sort of where tea loses places in the United States. Again, you probably are all somewhat familiar with this. This is essentially the beginning of the American Revolution. These are the revolutionaries dumping tea that has been imposed on them. Essentially, a tea tax was imposed. And to sort of protest, they went into the harbor and dumped all the tea in the harbor. Yeah, because tea is so monopolized by this one company, and that company is so invested by people in government, they're going to push this product to make money. And so that essentially kind of killed tea in the United States for the most part. Go to the next. This fellow, and this is a guy that's going to exemplify what happened. His name is Robert Fortune, and he was a botanist for the East India Company. And this is what kind of set the nail in the coffin for tea in Britain. In 1843 through 1861, he basically was sort of a botanist for the company, and at this time, tea is just being grown in China. They don't know how it's processed. It's not grown anywhere else quite yet. Britain has essentially taken hold of India through the East India Company, and they've got a lot of workers and a lot of places to farm tea if they can figure out how to do it. And what our little guy, Robert Fortune here does is he disguises himself as a Chinese businessman and ventures sort of into the interior of China and finds out where the tea is grown, how it's processed, and then he steals those tea plants and takes them to India and essentially starts the ball rolling on Indian tea plantation, which really ups the game for tea production.
He's from the U.S.
No, he's a Brit. Yeah. He's working for the East India Company. But really, that sort of set the nail in the coffin for coffee consumption in the UK.
What kind of tea is it that the switch.
At the time that they're, this is something I'm not as familiar with tea, but at the time, and I kind of drink tea from 7 Cups, and she's kind of told me about it. At the time that they're getting tea initially, that they're importing it before he kind of goes in and steals it. It's really all the crappy tea. The Chinese basically were not going to export the good stuff. So there is a type of keema, it's actually the same name. It's a very dark, it's a very dark tea. They didn't consider it very good, and that's the one that they usually traded. Robert Fortune, essentially, because they become so familiar with this tea, he doesn't care. He just sees it as tea. And they process it the same way they're used to getting it, which is why for such a long time you have that dark tea, and you don't really get the greens and the whites and the jasmines, because they're not familiar with it, and the taste hasn't grown.
So in India, I know this is not coffee focused,
it's okay.
But in India, the coffee culture comes from Britain.
Yeah, well, much
Crazy.
later.
Yeah,
Much later.
I mean, they're one of the biggest exporters of tea in the world.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, they just saw India as this sort of like a massive labor pool that they could exploit, essentially.
Interesting.
Right. So if you want to move on to that. I kind of want to make a nod to a couple other types of coffee cultures now that it's sort of moved into the European world, and it's sort of moving out of the European world now into the European colonies. I think one thing I should...
And right, by the way, whoever wants coffee is getting colder, so it's a good time. If you do want to get it now, thank you.
One thing I should probably mention is once it really takes hold in places like France, and the Dutch really start to get a taste for coffee, and they essentially are able to steal coffee beans that they can plant in other places. They plant them in their colonies, and their colonies initially are in the Caribbean for the French, and then the Dutch essentially in Indonesia. It's not quite grown in places like where today is the biggest coffee producer is Brazil, but that comes later actually. But initially it's the Caribbean and Indonesia. They're still getting it from places like Yemen, but it's just now it's expanding. But I wanted to give you this little portrait because it kind of shows both. This is Antico Cafe Greco in Roma. It's basically what I kind of wanted to show you was the times I've been to Europe, I've noticed in Italy, they kind of have a two-parter in the Italian coffee shops. There's the sit-down part, and there's the quick shop, right? This is for the espresso, the quick one. This is for sit-down with your friends. So I tend to notice that in Italy, there's sort of a two-part to the really nice old coffee shops. So when it goes to the next. Cafe Tazza di Oro, it's right in Rome on right next to the Pantheon, essentially. But one of the things I kind of want to show for the Italian coffee, especially today, is it's about being quick.
Yeah. In all the gas stations.
What's that?
In the gas stations. It's like people go to the petrol station to go and get a coffee.
You're basically going to stand there for 5 to 10 minutes.
Yeah, smash the espresso.
And just drink it.
It's amazing.
I've been to this shop, and one of the funniest things I saw was I was having a coffee, my wife and I, and another lady showed up, and she wanted a cafe mocha. And the guy in Italian, actually Italian a little bit, it's really, he basically says, "What do you want?" And she goes, "I want a cafe mocha." She goes, "No." And then he goes, and then she says, "Well, you can't. I see you do, hot chocolate." He goes, "Look, I'll give you espresso and I'll give you hot chocolate, but I'm not putting that coffee inside the hot chocolate. You can do that if you want." I was into the conversation.
Italian coffee culture is the best.
They tend to be really dark. The roast is like basically like ashes.
Yeah, but not even the coffee itself, how they consume it's unbelievable.
Yeah. The other thing I noticed, especially like around Rome, is they also have little neighborhood surf shops, and they sell sandwiches and stuff. The attitude's a little different, but usually the only people who go into those are just people that live right around the neighborhood. They're just like a convenience store basically that sells coffee.
But let me tell you something. I was just in Brazil with a bunch of Italians. We were doing coffee processing. And all of them at the beginning of the class, they start, those fruity coffees in the world and whatever. They were just putting down all the African coffees, the Ethiopians, the naturals and everything. But when I'm looking at the cookings, they actually go and taste the naturals more.
It's
Yeah.
interesting. I think what's
They say
happening
it's
is
because they have formed a culture, and there was not anything else available back then, really, for them to taste. But it's changing.
Yep.
And, you know, they were kind of funny when they were putting down all the experimental processes.
yeah.
But then if you observe them,
Yeah.
you know,
I think what's kind of happened is we all tend to think of history as sort of a linear thing. It goes from here and it goes there. But often it moves and bounces back. So I think what's happening is, what Burc's saying is, the culture of sort of hanging out at a coffee shop and sitting down and talking with your friends is sort of bouncing back to Italy now. And they're sort of starting to open those kind of shops. Moving on. So moving on to the United States, I just found this called Lion Coffee. But one thing I kind of want to show you is this is an 18th century sort of advertisement for this coffee. But coffee gets this other connotation, especially in the sort of growing United States. Coffee is fuel for expansion and prosperity, right? You need the coffee to stay up, get up early, I don't know, go chop down a forest and plant wheat, that kind of thing. It's healthier than water, and it sort of works with that sort of like very early, what you might call that Protestant work ethic. You know, think of people who put buckles on their hats and their shoes and work very hard all the time. Hope they haven't sinned or something like that. That kind of thing. But I kind of wanted to show that one of the connotations it takes over in the United States is sort of fuel for expansion and fuel for industry. So if you want to move on to next. This is the port of New Orleans in the 19th century. It was the biggest port for coffee importation because New Orleans was sort of the door to the Caribbean for the United States and generally the Latin American world, where coffee is starting to be grown more and more. Now in places like Colombia and Brazil, it's starting to take root. And
was your family there, Jason, around that time era, or?
they were a little bit out of loop. They were in Louisiana, just a little bit. By 1857, 530,000 bags of coffee, and it was nicknamed the logical port because of its sort of existence. I don't know how many of you are familiar with New Orleans. A lot of everyone's familiar with New York. To me, New Orleans is sort of like the New York of the South. The port, anyways. And we have a lot of different culture coming in here too, right? Not only do you have the old French culture, you have new immigrants coming in from Ireland, Italy. Of course, you have people that are from the United States already. It was a massive place of industry, and it was really the feeder for coffee to the United States. One of the things you might know is during the Civil War, the port was one of the first things that was taken by the Union, the North. And so coffee gets cut off in most of the United States, including the South. And one of the alternatives they use is chicory. Familiar? A little root. You can roast it. Tastes kind of like
It's like
coffee. What's that?
Pero.
Yeah, it's
Like in Italy, they drink that.
kind of like coffee, but not quite. You know, you add a lot of sugar and milk. You close your eyes, it might be.
What's
That kind of
Sorry, did you say what was the one that it will talk about?
chicory.
Chicory.
Yeah,
We've bought it with the word pero.
yeah. Today, in Café du Monde, which is basically the sort of old celebrated coffee house, right in well, it's really right by the little quay right there, across from the statue of Jackson, is Café du Monde, and they do chicory coffee. They actually do. It's actually
It's a touristic attraction, so
Yeah.
they serve beignets and.
Yeah.
yeah. It's actually super cheap,
Yeah.
and it's actually not bad if you've been out for a while because it's open 24 hours.
So it's not coffee.
Oh, it's coffee,
Oh, it
but
is.
it's coffee, and they actually add chicory to it. So they add it as kind of a flavoring almost.
So it's a different plant chicory?
It's a totally different plant.
It's a blend.
Yeah, it was used as an alternative, complete alternative.
But it has caffeine in it?
Otherwise.
No,
It doesn't.
No.
So then what's the point?
just kind of close to the flavor.
It comes with
Like
the
if you
coffee.
put, yeah, but it's,
It's already got caffeine in the coffee.
so it's a flavour.
Basically, yeah.
Yes.
People got used to that chicory flavor as the alternative, and they kind of combined it with the coffee once the war was over and got
Maybe
coffee
like
back.
the flavor of coffee, but you don't want caffeine.
Yeah. Let's see where I'm at. If you want to move to the next place. This is the old chuck wagon. Again, coffee is the main staple of a lot of the people expanding in the United States. And again, this is just sort of the fuel for expansion idea. If you want to go next, please.
The iPhone resolutions are pretty low that time too.
Yeah, this is actually, Memi got the wrong one, but it's okay. That's something else I want to use. There was a slide that I had on another version, but I'll explain it to you. There was once a temperance movement to move people away from coffee essentially in the 17th century in the UK. They thought it was an enfeebling drink, right? Well, here we are in the 19th century trying to get people on coffee because they don't want them going to drink liquor. So a lot of people in the temperance movement would, essentially in big cities, would drive around these enormous coffee pots and essentially try to get those who they considered, maybe a little bit too sloshed to get on the coffee instead of the alcohol. If you want to go to the next one. This is kind of a little shot I got of a coffee stall in Mexico City about the turn of the 19th century. This is kind of neat. I just thought it was a kind of cool photo, but again, coffee is expanded to basically everywhere at this point. Basically anywhere on the planet, you can probably buy a cup of coffee. It may not be the best cup of coffee, like the guy said in the previous video, because at this point, coffee is just going to be black, right? It's black. It's got to taste like, like hell, like the guy says. At this point too, I found out one other thing was interesting is they used to, this is before coffee is filtered. We really filtered coffee is essentially a little bit of a new thing. They would put eggshells in the coffee. I don't know exactly why they would do that. They thought it would take out impurities or something like that. It's a very strange thing.
Sorry, by what year was it that it was everywhere?
I would say really you can get coffee just about anywhere essentially by the year 1900, right? Just about anywhere in the world, because now it's being grown everywhere. So it's moved from those Caribbean islands, but the French are really, occupying and growing a lot of coffee in, and it's moved on to other places like Brazil, Colombia, Mexico. And so because it's becoming such a huge export, the consumption of coffee goes up as it's being exposed, right? And because it's such a popular drink, people are going to get on the money train. So now coffee's everywhere. You can get a cup of coffee here, you can get a cup of coffee in Indonesia, you can get a cup of coffee just about anywhere. But I kind of want to show that you pretty much get coffee just about anywhere you go.
And what year was this?
It's about 1900.
So the second half of 1800s is actually where you can see the coffee everywhere, and then 1900s are the times that it just becomes a very important part of life.
Yeah, sort of everyday. If you want to go next. So this is a coffee shop in the 1930s. And the reason I kind of use this in the United States, a coffee shop, is it's sort of coffee is now being paired with food. Not always intentionally. So if you're not familiar, in the United States in the 30s, there was a prohibition against alcohol. So alcohol was essentially banned. Tea is not a popular drink in the United States, so the alternative is coffee. So you get that idea of the cafe in the American sense versus the French sense.
Is tea coming back in the United States now?
I think
With all that bubble tea and stuff.
I think a little by little, yeah.
Yeah.
But kind of one thing I wanted to show here though is that whereas you see that place like the Cafe Procope that we saw a little while ago, quite nice. It's a little bit more of a nice experience. This is sort of an everyman experience. Everybody kind of enjoys this. You can get a basic sandwich or a basic meal and a cup of coffee because you're not going to get beer, you're not going to get wine because it's actually illegal, right?
How long was it legal for?
It's about, I think it's about 10 years. Yeah, it's about 10 years or so.
What sparked that?
What sparked it?
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of off topic, but basically the temperance movement, those folks earlier who were trying to get people off alcohol and drink coffee, they really ramped up their work and got it out to the U.S. Congress to ban alcohol. I mean, think about it. This is a time where probably alcohol is seen as one of the biggest problems. I mean, this is before you see things like very hard, super hard drugs coming in. So it's.
It could be a little influence of the mobs too, because that was their income and they were still doing it. was just they were preventing other distribution.
Yeah, so it sort of gives a bit of a stimulation for coffee in the United States because it's such an acceptable drink. In fact, if you look at a lot of sort of movies made about it, you still have places serving alcohol, but they're usually serving it in coffee cups. Because if, somebody walks in at some cop that's not on the take, they can just pretend they're drinking coffee, right? If you want to move on, please. This is also the Depression era. So a lot of parts of the world in the 1930s suffered an economic depression. And the thing I kind of wanted to point out is, so these sort of like soup kitchens would pop up for people who basically didn't have money to buy food even. But one of the staples is soup, coffee, donuts. So coffee is now seen as sort of like it's right up there with bread, right? As a staple part of the diet. And move on. This is kind of moving into an advertisement I saw during World War II. And it's basically a factory worker. And coffee still has retaining that coffee an aid to factory efficiency, right? They still got the idea that we need to get pumped at those people with coffee so they can pump out all those bullets and tanks and whatnot. And coffee was sort of like one of those things that was seen as sort of to keep the workers' minds straight or sharp.
Jason, that's also how espresso was invented in Italy, right?
Yeah.
Like the factory efficiency, they didn't want people to
Kind of. Going back a touch to espresso is, are you ever familiar with a mocha pot? Little guy, mocha pot looks like a sort of little coffee pot you're going to put on a burner, right? But it takes time. It's got to boil the water. It's got to push the water through the little filter. So what happens is a lot of these places in Italy that are, you might have a town that's got a group of workers. They want their coffee, but instead of waiting for it, that's just really where the espresso machine comes in. Where you get that preset hot water ready to roll, pump out the hot water right away. Instead of putting it on the burner and these guys are waiting while they're eating their lunch. But I mean, Italians take like 3-hour lunches right now, anyways. So. So another coffee advert. This is basically, again, coffee for the worker, but instead of the industrial worker, this is sort of professional level. Coffee always gives you a break. Again, this is fuel for the office worker too, right? So not just the guy in the factory. Anybody move? Again, coffee is basically going to be drunk anywhere, even up there. So one of the things you start. What's that? Yeah. One of the things I kind of start to notice is, if you think about it, and everything I've talked about is, coffee essentially becomes an every person kind of drink, right? So you have the intellectuals, you have the office worker, you have essentially people working in a lot of the heavy industry. It's one of those sort of drinks that sort of crosses all of those boundaries, right? Everybody's got a use for it in some way, shape, or form. And I think that's probably one of the reasons it's so popular, is because it doesn't have like, only that kind of person drinks coffee. Everybody drinks coffee. Well, for the most part. So if you move on, please. This is the little, I call it the little Greek coffee shop cup. And this becomes kind of iconic. If you've seen a lot of movies and TV shows that take place in a city like New York, often they're holding this little coffee cup. Because essentially, what this means is, you want to go to the next one, is this guy is going somewhere, right? He means business. He's got his old sack lunch, and he's got his cup of coffee, and he's ready to make money, right? That's what this kind of has come to mean. Is if you've got the cup of coffee, you are essentially upwardly mobile. But at the same time, you got the other guy drinking the coffee out of the thermos. So it's an every person kind of drink. So if I go next. And we're kind of moving on into what I would call maybe the current era.
That's Jasmine, right?
Right, I think that was Jasmine, yeah. They're third wave coffee. And I think what it's coming back to is, it's really coming back to that idea of quality, right? So up until really maybe the 80s even, coffee was just like the same everywhere you went, right? Nobody went to like, we didn't have really shops that were specialty coffee shops like you might list Savaya or a couple others in town. It was basically, you got coffee at Denny's, right? Just like same everywhere you go.
What's Denny's?
Denny's is like a fat. It's like
I
a
don't want to know.
yeah. It's basically kind of like a diner. Say, I don't know if you're familiar with diner.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a diner.
Yeah.
But that was good enough. Now we're moving on to a place where coffee is going back to quality, right? We're kind of looking for something that maybe we missed, right? So we got all the maybe call it the camaraderie. We got all the intellectual. We got it as fuel for society, fuel for work, fuel for the mind, fuel for the body. As far as medicine, we would consider it medicine. But now we really want to enjoy it and find out, because we kind of talked about earlier on the previous video is, well, what have we been missing? So if you want to go to the next. These are the ladies from Cafe Femenino in Peru. And I just wanted to point this out is this also makes other opportunities for people in other parts of the world. So as far as I recall from people who originally we started getting Cafe Femenino from was a lot of these ladies coffee wasn't their first job. This was something they were kind of doing on the side, sometimes in small plots even.
And also very seasonal.
Yeah, seasonal. They were
harvest times.
they might co-opt their money to basically buy a very small farm. And what it really took was it took people like this and other people in other parts of the world that wanted to help people like this and say, you can grow that stuff and just make the black stuff, or we can show you what people are looking for in these sort of third wave coffee shops. So there's a real sort of like back and forth now. People aren't, especially in what I would call the coffee movement now, is they're looking for real cooperation. Whereas you saw previously, it was really exploitation of coffee. As much as you can get out, just make it black. Now it's trying to find out, can we give people a decent wage to make their life better? And can we really sort of make it work both ways? Can we get a good product and pay something fair to them? That's kind of where it's going to. So if you want to go next. This is our friend Burc with the Mendes brothers in Huejotzingo in Guatemala. So now, unlike before, where you have a massive company like a Folgers or Yuben, who, the people who are roasting the coffee have never met the growers. Now roasters, they want to know the growers.
Can you tell I'm not the farmer?
What? Yeah. They want to know the growers.
Yeah.
Because now we've got that two-way communication where they're going to grow better coffee and he's going to get a better product. And they're going to get
the same belt I'm wearing today.
Yeah, and so I kind of want to show that off. So I just want to go next. You saw a little bit about coffee cupping. So basically, this is again just trying to find the high quality that's kind of happening today, and I guess in many parts of the world. That's kind of what we talked a little bit before. Is I think what happened is that coffee idea kind of started here for the most part, and it's moved on to, it's gone back to other places like Europe and other parts of the world where they're starting to sort of like we're seeing Faris in Yemen, right? The place where coffee started. We tasted a coffee that's like amazing. He's got a special fermentation process at a particular temperature, at a particular pressure. That's like, I'm sure it's going to sell for like $5,000 a pound or something, right? I'm not kidding. Like, it probably will. And
Faris lives in London, actually.
Yeah, he lives in London.
And sells the Yemeni coffee from London.
I think he's originally from Yemen,
He's originally from Yemen.
and he sort of went back and said, we're gonna produce high quality specialty coffee. Go next, please.
What is the market for that kind of coffee?
People like you.
I wouldn't pay that much for coffee.
Are you talking about that? No. The reason a lot of times you go those high-end coffees that go for that price, usually from an auction.
Okay.
And they're like these whales that will just these people use like money to start campfires and stuff.
What kind of person are you looking at? Is it just like
Well,
super wealthy people that just have way too much money?
For that one, yeah.
Yeah.
But he's also selling other coffee that's a great quality. It is affordable too.
I have his coffees.
Yeah.
I have his coffees in the store. Some of the auction coffees, they sell for like hundreds of dollars per pound. But the ones that I get are under the $100. But I think they're very experienced.
Yeah.
Per cup. It's like that $25 coffee actually in that cup. But when you brew it, it's even cheaper than that for a person who brews it. But the coffee coffee is like, it's not like you're gonna have it every day, you know, or every day. It's great coffee once in a while.
So, yeah, this is just a picture of Burc. It was just in Kenya,
It
I
was in
think.
Kenya, yeah.
Yeah, and so again, this is more the end retailer becoming much more involved now with where it all begins. Right.
I think that photo was taken with a Nokia.
Yeah?
It
It was a long time ago. So next, please. This is us years ago. This is, I don't know why I have this in here, but basically, it's Turkish coffee. It's just sort of going back to community. It still never lost that, right? Like,
Where's this?
this is at Savaya at Williams. It's basically just going back to the same idea that you're still going to share coffee with friends. I mean, you could sit around and eat a bowl of apples, I guess, if you wanted to, right? But coffee sort of took that place and said, no, you're going to have probably a cup of coffee. So you want to go next, please? I called this Coffee Love. I don't know why. I just thought it was a cool photo. These are people that we know. And, at the Long Cantata location where Burc has a Savaya, there were just people that would meet there every Saturday, you know, and like these people like have known each other for years. I mean, we've known them for years, but it still has never lost. It's still a commodity, but it's never lost. I think the familiar feeling of that people gather around coffee. The next, that's me and my wife and my daughter. I just want to plug that in there.
She's
First-
older now, but she has the same look, kind of.
Yeah, I think the first place we went to after sort of we left the house after she was born was here, right? Like the first time we were like gonna go somewhere, we went and got like breakfast and then came here.
With the baby and coffee too.
She's tried it. Yeah, she's 8 now, but yeah, that was when she was about 1.
You serious?
Oh, yeah.
But last one, again, just coming back to this is the place where it begins and it sort of ends my little spiel about coffee. It never lost, that community feeling. It's where it started in the family, and people make new families. They come back to coffee. Just very easy, comfortable, refreshing, nice thing to sit with and talk. But that's pretty much it. I hope you kind of got the idea that what I was trying to show is that it moves around the world. It has its effect on different things, but it becomes sort of a lot of things to a lot of people at the same time. And I can't really think of another beverage that's really like that, right? Where it can be enjoyed by just about everyone in every situation. You can meet your friends, you can go by yourself, you can essentially talk about the coffee you're enjoying. You can enjoy great coffee, you can enjoy horrible coffee, I suppose. But it really has an effect on our society now where we can go anywhere in the world and have a cup of coffee. So, hopefully that's.
Like how the Turks and Greeks argue on
I should
who invented the
ask. I never asked this.
baklava. The coffee also
Yeah.
has some struggle between the Yemenis and the Ethiopians.
Yeah.
Where does the Greek coffee come from? I think genetically it was discovered that the first coffee species came from Ethiopia,
Yeah.
but the first coffee cultivation and farming started in Yemen. Actually, Jason talked about the kind of the global spread of coffee in terms of consumption. I want to really quickly summarize how the coffee spread throughout the world in terms of coffee farming. How the plants spread throughout the world. Basically, I'm going to do it very quickly so that you can have a few minutes with your groups. This is where Yemen is. So even if it were discovered in Ethiopia, the coffee cultivation first started in Yemen. The spread of coffee from Yemen let's do it like this. The first places that had coffee plants outside of Yemen was a monk brought coffee from Yemen to India, and the Dutch brought coffee. These were kind of smuggling coffee outside of Yemen. Oh, if you think about it, the Ottomans conquered the Arabian Peninsula where Saudi Arabia is, and parts of Egypt, and all the way to Aden, Yemen included. So basically, they appointed governors in different states. I had a personal history in the family. My great-grandfather, who used to work for the Sultan, he had a disagreement with the Sultan, and he was exiled from Istanbul, the capital. And Yemen was the farthest state, so they exiled him all the way to Yemen. That's how they were exposed to coffee. But basically, when coffee was first discovered, it wasn't consumed like how you're consuming it today. It was consumed more like a soup. It wasn't the beverage that you're having after it's roasted, after it's ground, after it's brewed. There are lots of books that are telling otherwise, but it wasn't the case. There is no documented history that shows that coffee was a beverage before that.
It sort of makes sense, though,
right.
right?
But we're talking about mid-1500s,
Yeah.
when they first brought coffee to Istanbul, where it became the beverage. But up until 1650s, the coffee remained only in Yemen, and the only distribution, they kind of monopolized that. The Ottomans monopolized the coffee plant and distribution. It wasn't available elsewhere. The smuggling happened. The coffee went from Yemen to India, and only like 7 seeds that started the Indian coffee plantation. And the Dutch took it to Indonesia. What's interesting here is, also from Yemen, it came to an island here called Reunion Island, but it's called Bourbon, or Bourbon, or...
It's just off the coast.
Yeah, that variety of coffee gets its name from this island. But basically from this island, it came to Amsterdam, to the botanical garden, but it wouldn't really flourish there.
So,
and from Amsterdam, it was given as a gift to the French emperor, and the French emperor put it in a greenhouse and called it the noble tree. So from the noble tree, again, they couldn't cultivate it in Europe because coffee doesn't like frost, and it likes altitude. Basically, a naval officer figured this plant out, and he was stationed in the Caribbean. He took a branch from that noble tree. It was in the greenhouse in France. And he brought to an island called Martinique in the Caribbean. And the Caribbean coffee plantations got their first seeds from that island, out of that French naval officer.
That initial Dutch guy, that basically what they would do is to kind of keep the coffee a secret almost, was, I understand they would boil it. After it's processed, sometimes they would boil it so that you couldn't replant that seed, because really the bean is a seed, right? The idea is that this Dutch guy who stole the coffee, found a couple that weren't boiled yet, and literally hid him in his underpants, and that's basically how he smuggled out the coffee.
And they inspired the Indonesians.
That's the story. That's how your job got started, ladies and gentlemen, was in somebody's underpants, basically.
Okay. Delete that information.
Yeah, it's there.
But anyway, so everything kind of spread out from Yemen. Main places, India. There was a stop here on Sri Lanka, Ceylon.
Yeah.
So there was some plantations there. And then basically Indonesia had the major growth. And from that Bourbon Island, it came to Brazil. But the Europeans, French basically brought it to the Caribbean. It started spreading around here. We're looking at 1700s for that. So for the first 150 years that coffee was around, it wasn't even available in plantations over here. So it took about a century before the coffee plantations
When it goes to
became
India,
a thing.
it doesn't have a mass. It's not a mass plantation.
Well, mass started after basically Brazil took over.
Right, that's the big one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's kind of how the spread of the coffee history started. The very, according to the genetic backgrounds, the Arabica species were found in Ethiopia. So know that. Arabica coffee was first discovered in Ethiopia in terms of species, not farming yet. And the Robusta beans were actually dated back to the Belgian Congo. So Congo was the first birthplace for the Robusta beans. The rest is history, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay. Well, we can talk a lot about this, but I want to be mindful about the time.
Yep.
So let me repeat the groups one more time.